Hello, I'm Brian Maffly with the Salt Lake Tribune, and welcome to our Trib Talk, where we are discussing with Cory MacNulty of the National Parks Conservation Association the reopening of Utah's national parks after several weeks of being closed in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. Welcome, Cory. It's nice to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so for starters, we've timed today's Trib Talk with the busy weekend that just ended with Memorial Day, traditionally the busiest weekend of the year for Utah's parks, which are extremely crowded these days. And 3 of Utah's Mighty 5 have reopened in the last few weeks, starting with Capitol Reef, Bryce Canyon 2 weeks ago, Zion National Park a week after that, and then on this coming Friday, Arches and Canyonlands will open. And for starters, Cory, we wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your organization's concerns about the parks reopening at a time when coronavirus infections seem to be still pretty high in Utah. Is this the right thing to be doing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brian. We have been really concerned about the coronavirus, and we're very supportive of the parks closing several weeks ago when we really saw visitation, particularly in the Utah parks, start to increase I think it was in March, and there was actually a lot of congestion and crowding in the parks, and there wasn't the ability to social distance. So at that time, we really supported the closing of the national parks because we felt that it was not safe for visitors, and it certainly was not safe for park staff or the communities neighboring those parks. There has been increasing pressure to open the national parks there, and including from the administration, as well as local communities. And as the state reopened, there's really been encouragement to reopen the national parks. I think people have really realized what a challenge it is, and that particularly tourist destinations have been disproportionately affected by the closures, which contributes to that desire to really open the parks and, get back to business as normal. So we understand that the parks are reopening and there is the pressure to do that, but we really encourage caution and really careful safety procedures to protect the park staff, visitors, communities, as well as the resources that the parks are there to protect.
Yeah. Well, as we've seen, the 3 parks that are open are not fully open. And they're all phasing in or reopening in different ways, which adds the confusion. Generally speaking, they are not accepting entry fees, although Bryce Canyon is going to be or already has started taking entry fee. Visitor centers, museums, theaters, the stores are closed for the most part. There seems to be some effort by the Park Service to staff tables in front of their visitor centers to provide helpful information to visitors. And then in some cases, many trails in popular areas are closed. In Zion, for example, has probably the most complicated arrangement of all the parks. A lot of stuff is great destinations are available, but others are not. Angel's Landing, that section of the trail, one of the most popular hikes in Utah, that section of the trail where it's very steep and precipitous and there's a chain, that's closed for very understandable reasons.
Yeah. There's no way to distance.
Yeah,
and you have to hold on to the chain. So it's not a good place to be.
Yeah, but also the Co-op Canyon area is closed there.
Yes.
And then other great trails are closed because of trail maintenance issues, like at the Emerald Pools, Weeping Rock, up to Observation Point. And until recently, the Narrows was closed. And now that the water's lower, it is now open.
Yes.
But what's happened is you wind up, I guess a concern we've talked about before is that when you have some places open and others not open, aren't you concentrating use in some of those places that are open, like the Cayena Trail and the West Rim Trail and the Riverwalk in Zion? People who visit there know those trails. They're amazing. And they can get crowded. Even on a not busy day in Zion, those are crowded trails. What are your concerns there, Cory?
Well, I think, one thing, and as you noted, all the parks are opening in very different ways. And I think part of that is, a lot of communication with the local communities and the amount of caution. And that varies really across Southern Utah, from the Southeast Health District that has been most cautious, which is why Arches and Canyonlands are not open. And Moab has been very cautious. Central Utah Health Department has been, quite careful and cautious, and Southwest Utah Health Department has been a little less concerned about keeping the parks closed. And so that's
where Zion and Bryce are based.
Where Zion and Bryce are based. And so that's why you've seen the different openings in different ways. And I think what people need to understand is that this is the time of year when rangers are coming on for the season, and that was delayed significantly because of the COVID and just in housing issues. So there's fewer, you can't, concentrate people in housing, shared housing, because it could spread the virus. And they were really cautious about bringing rangers in from across the country into these smaller communities and rural parts of the United States where the parks are. And so there are fewer staff. And so we're at the busiest time of year with fewer staff and new safety measures that have to be put in place. So I imagine that part of the phased opening is that they really don't have the staff to maintain the level of, keep visitors and staff safe across the full range of the parks. Okay. I do have to say also that we really value the expertise of the superintendents and their communication with their park staff. They've done, just incredible risk assessments to look at which parts of their parks are most at risk and where they will have the most difficult time having social distancing and being able to maintain the resources. So there's just a lot of complex factors that go into that. And the park staff are working with their local communities and local health departments to determine what is best for these places. As far as concentrating people in smaller places by not having all of the parks open, I think that's definitely a concern. I understand why they're doing it in terms of, their operations and making sure things run smoothly. But in parks like Zion and Bryce and Arches, they're just crowded. So even when the whole park is open, they're crowded. Yeah. In Zion, I think people need to realize that the shuttle is not running, and that is really key to being able to run at full capacity. So without the shuttle going up Zion Canyon, they can only accommodate about a third or a quarter of the visitation that they would normally have this time of year. And so that's all based on parking right now. So that actually does remove the number of people up the canyon. It minimizes it.
Yeah, that's right. The Zion has told me that they think about 1,000 people could be in Zion Canyon at any given time with the way they manage the 6-7 mile road up into Zion Canyon. So what you've heard this weekend was that by 6:30 a.m. on Saturday and Sunday, Zion closed the canyon road because there was already the 400 cars had already gone up. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what they're having to do is they've got gates up the canyon. And so they have about 350 to 400 parking spaces. And then they just have to close the gate when they're full. And there isn't really a place for cars to queue up. So a lot of cars keep circling through. I mean, it sounded like things went as smoothly as possible this weekend, but it was definitely really busy as expected. And they just don't have the capacity that they would normally have.
Okay. Well, we spoke to the mayor of Moab, Emily Niehaus, last week, and she had heard Arches was going to do something similar. Arches they haven't confirmed that for me, but would you think that that would be a smart thing for that park to do?
Well, we haven't heard details about how they're opening, and I think they're still working out those details for this week, and they have not been made public. And I would just say for people who are listening, I think one of the keys is to, if you want to go to one of the parks, you really have to do your homework and understand what's open and what's not, and how to visit these places right now. We are supportive of, in order to maintain health and safety right now, we are supportive of timed entry systems that would, and I know they're looking at that at various parks. They're considering it at Rocky Mountain National Park as they consider opening this week. I haven't heard if they've gotten permission to do that, but they have publicly asked for that, as well as the communities around the park have asked for that. And I think the delegation in Colorado has also asked for a timed entry system there.
Yeah, that proposal was floated at the end of the Obama administration by Arches, by the superintendent, Kate Cannon at the time. And as we've seen, that proposal kind of fell on its face. There was a lot of opposition. The congressional delegation of Utah didn't support it, and it seems like it's gotten shelved. Would you like to see that proposal taken back off the shelf and get some serious consideration?
We are supportive of giving superintendents the tools they need in order to manage visitors. I think at this time, in some ways, we need to set that discussion aside in terms of long-term visitor management, because we don't know how the pandemic is really going to affect the parks long-term and park visitation. What we're seeing right now is these are the places people want to go. And so I think right now what we really need to focus on is this a tool that can effectively help to keep visitors and communities and park staff safe? And we believe it is a tool that can do that. And particularly if it's tied in with reservations on, recreation.gov, and I think it gives people a lot of certainty when they're visiting the park, to know that they have one of those parking spaces in Zion. I think it also is an important tool that could actually allow park staff to open places more quickly. Okay. So we have heard that if there's a way to do reservations, once they figure out how to run shuttles safely in terms of social distancing, if people could actually get a ticket for a particular shuttle, they may be able to actually open the shuttles more quickly, and other places where they know they can manage. And it's a proven technique. There are a lot of parks where at particular destinations you do need tickets, and it works in terms of managing numbers.
Yeah, but wait, like what's an example of a destination inside a park where they have tickets to visit? You mean like Old Faithful or something?
Not Old Faithful, but Muir Woods, you need a reservation in order to get parking. Yeah. When you go to Alcatraz, Ellis Island, I mean, it's a proven technique for destinations, and I think it could really work here in terms of giving certainty to visitors that are coming and helping communities in the parks know what to expect. Yeah.
Well, this kind of reminds me that there was an op-ed that the retired superintendent of Grand Canyon posted, I think, in probably the Arizona newspaper, in which he raised his concern that a lot of our national parks, there are these iconic destinations, and Yellowstone is one of those. Old Faithful, rather, in Yellowstone is one of those where people gather in really big numbers. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like, you'll never be able to enforce proper social distance at a place like that. And it's not reasonable to expect park rangers to be the social distance police. What do we do? And his proposal was maybe we shouldn't open the parks. I think that's not reasonable now that we have the Interior Secretary saying, no, the park shall be open. We're going to, quote, increase recreational access. That said, what can be done at a place like Delicate Arch in Arches, which I expect is going to see a lot of people next weekend? What can be done there to make sure it's not become a what do they call it? A coronavirus super spreader event.
Yes, exactly. And I think, so a couple of myths I think people really need to consider before they decide if they're going to go, is that, so we totally understand the desire to want to go to national parks and to be outdoors right now, and are really excited actually about how people are valuing the outdoors and our national parks. But there is this, this idea that you can go to national parks and there's plenty of room to spread around and to social distance. And certainly there are places in the parks where you can do that. But our national parks are really designed with trails and viewpoints that really funnel visitors to particular destinations, whether they're historic sites or natural wonders. And so they aren't really designed to spread people out across the landscape. And in fact, as you noted, some of the parks, the backcountry, some parks backcountry is open and some is not open. And so people need to realize that they will be in areas that are congested. It will be very difficult, even if they're trying to do their best to social distance. And I think there's also an impression that the only people coming to Utah parks are Utah residents. So it's a fairly safe place to be because our cases aren't as high as some other places. But that's not what they're seeing. So the park staff are really monitoring license plates in their parking areas, and they are seeing people from across the country, a lot of people from California. And so there are people coming from densely populated areas into our rural communities, and they could potentially be spreading the virus. And it's hard to social distance. So I think those are things that people really need to think about in terms of their own risk assessment and calculations.
Okay, very good. And then what, should the parks consider shutting back down if their employees start testing positive? Is that something that should happen?
I think the parks have been very clear that's an option on the table. They're really asking for visitors to be responsible for themselves and to be careful, and that if it's not working and they don't feel like it's safe for visitors, staff, and the communities, that they will have to consider closures. And I think it's something that we need to consider because we don't know as we open things up what the response is going to be and if we're going to see the virus spread further. And if we see those cases going up dramatically, particularly in these rural communities where there aren't the medical facilities, then I think that's something we have to consider, whether it's national parks or other destinations.
Sure, of course. I mean, a national park is just one of many tourist destinations. And what we've seen across the country over the weekend was some, not in Utah, but elsewhere, some pretty frightening disregard for social distancing norms at some of the beaches in the Southeast and Lake of the Ozarks. So far, we haven't heard anything like that at our parks, but
I think there is congestion, and what I have heard is that there are very few people wearing masks.
Okay.
And I know that's, can be controversial right now, and people feel that they don't need to wear them outside. And I think there's a lot of places where you don't. But if you are in close contact with people in a congested area, it's something that should definitely be considered.
Okay.
And I think, you had asked earlier about whether or not the rangers should be the social distancing police. And I know in talking to various park staff, not only in Utah, but across the country, that as parks open, staff safety has really been put at a high level. and one of the most important things that they're looking at. And I think they're going to, so they're going to use signs. They're going to give as much direction as they can to guide people. But people really need to take responsibility for themselves. And I think if, they're certainly going to try, but if people are resistant, they're going to make sure that they're staying safe, because the rangers, some rangers in our popular parks can interact with hundreds of people from across the country in any given day. And so, as you said, you don't want the parks to actually be a source of the virus.
Yeah, but then do the parks even have the authority to require social distance and the wearing of masks? I don't think
they don't.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not doing that right now. Whether or not they could have the authority, I'm not sure. But they are not trying to do that. But they are. So right now, the only visitor center that's open that I'm aware of in Utah is at Bryce Canyon. Yeah. The other visitor centers are closed. Most of the campgrounds, except for one in Zion, are closed. So what they're doing is really kind of keeping the facilities where people would be concentrating, particularly indoors, closed.
Okay.
But those are, some of the lodging and campgrounds and other things will likely open as we move through the phases.
Okay. Would you feel it's important for the parks to resume collecting entry fees, or is that not much of a priority?
That's a really good question. So Bryce, as far as I know Bryce is the only one that has a gate and they're collecting entrance fees. I think Capitol Reef is collecting them, but it's a remote collection. Yeah. And the other parks have not yet. So I think if they can figure out how to collect fees safely, it is great. I know we've heard that actually a lot of visitors are going and really want to pay that entrance fee because they know how important that funding is to the functioning of the parks. Yeah. But they don't want to, be having interaction between the rangers and visitors in that close of contact. So as long as they can do it safely, ideally, collecting fees online would be ideal, because that funding is really important for the functioning of the parks. And that's been, it's been months now when they haven't had that funding.
It's been completely disrupted. For quite some time. Good. And then we've also heard down in which park was it? In Bryce, that they have opened their visitor center, and visitor centers are, I think that's the only one. Like I said, things change one day to the next. And the visitor center issue is an interesting one because it is where people come to learn about the parks, learn about, people who come to the parks for the most part are very unfamiliar with them. They don't know what to expect when they get to a certain destination. Are there a lot of people go to that? Or is there water? Is there trash? Are there restrooms? The visitor center is where you get those questions answered. Yeah. And if they're closed, then people don't have ready access to that information. Yet if they're open, now we have people concentrating in a confined indoor space. There seems to be a catch-22 there. And what can be done to get information to these visitors to make sure they have a quality experience, and B, stay safe and don't promote transmission of coronavirus? What can be done?
That's a great question. So even though the visitor centers aren't open, I think most of the parks have rangers. So at Zion, for example, they have outdoor orientation rangers. So you can have that, ask the questions that you were just talking about. If people do talk to the rangers, we just ask that they stay that social distance, which is hard for us as people.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I think
it's ringing on the computer. My apologies. I'm using my phone, but it just makes my computer.
Yes. Okay. So I think the key for people right now is to do a lot of homework before you go. Some of the parks like Zion and Bryce, both have really good maps online that show what's open and what's closed visually. And they ask that you print that information out before you go. I think people need to realize that the experience that they're expecting might not be the experience they would have right now. And people might want to think about waiting until the parks do fully open so that they can have that experience that they really want. But it's key to do the research, to really understand what's open and closed and where you want to go, and make sure you take that information with you. And anybody who goes to the parks right now needs to be even more self-sufficient than usual. So you need to have all your protective gear. You need to have your own hand sanitizer. Unfortunately, toilet paper and hand sanitizer has been been taken from the parks consistently. So, and pack out your trash. And I think it's really key for people to understand that the parks are limited with their staffing right now, and that rangers are doing the best that they can with fewer rangers, more safety protocols. And so I think everybody just needs to be as patient as possible and be flexible. So if you come to a trailhead where you wanted to hike, you need to have backup plans because if that trailhead is full or really busy where you don't think you can be safe, you need to be able to go to another location.
Okay. Well, we just got a couple questions from some viewers. So we've kind of already touched on them a little, but I think these are important. This is from Michelle. Why haven't they adopted a permit reservation system for popular trails? These trails are huge, and there must be a way to help dissipate the crowds better. I had the same question even before COVID. And you know what? Me too, Michelle. And at Arches and Zion, there are a lot of the popular trails do require permits, like the Narrows at Zion, Fiery Furnace at Arches. But anyway, Cory, maybe you could comment on that, on the viewer's question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, especially now. It is a tool that the parks are talking about. What we're seeing with this administration is there is a lot of influence from local communities, county commissioners, the state, in terms of what tools are available to superintendents and what tools are not. Reservations and timed entry through visitor use management and traffic congestion management for Zion and Arches have been incredibly controversial here. And so I think there is a reluctance from this administration, unless there is a unified voice from our delegation and from those local entities asking for this tool. It's going to be hard for us to get approval. I think if Rocky Mountain National Park is allowed to do that because they have that local support and it shows to be effective, I think that could be really helpful for that option to be available here in Utah.
Yeah, and we have another question about whether camping is regulated at the parks, and I can answer part of that. For the most part, backcountry camping at all the parks is prohibited at this time. I'm sure that'll change. And the developed campgrounds are closed at some parks, open at others. So I think you might know, Cory, which campgrounds are available at this time. You mentioned Zion. I think the
Watchman campground is open, and there are reservations for Watchman, and those were booked up a long time ago, but perhaps people won't arrive. So that's a question. And then at Capitol Reef, the primitive campgrounds are available. So Cedar Mesa and Cathedral Valley, very limited spots there. But those are the only ones that I know of right now. I think all the other campgrounds are closed, although they are looking at dates for reopening those.
Sunset Campground, which is a reservation campground at Bryce Canyon, will be open soon if it's not open already.
Yeah.
And your reference to Capitol Reef reminded me something. The way they phase their reopening is 180 degrees different than what Bryce Canyon's doing. So Bryce Canyon has its front country open, scenic drive open. that it's at Capitol Reef, it's just their backcountry, and the scenic drive is closed. Why are they doing things completely differently?
Well, the scenic drive now is open. So right before Memorial Weekend, they opened scenic drive and all the trails off of scenic drive.
Capitol Reef we're referring to.
Yeah, Capitol Reef, as well as the trails off of Highway 24.
Yeah.
So I think, again, the reason why they opened it that way is likely because of communication with the local communities and really wanting to provide access, but avoid some of those congested areas, that they have in scenic drive, because that's where they really get the congestion in Capitol Reef, whereas the others are more dispersed. And so social distancing is easier. Whereas I think Bryce, a lot of the desire to reopen was around tourism and businesses and really drawing the visitors to those communities and to the park, which is why they opened the most popular destinations, and some of the backcountry is closed. That's just my speculation. I have not talked to the leaders of those parks to see exactly what the calculus was behind the different decisions.
Cool. Well, to wrap this up, Cory, you're going to give a letter grade to the Park Service for their handling of the reopening of the parks to date. A, B, C, D, pass, fail. What would you say?
Oh, that's hard, Brian. I would say that I've been really impressed with how carefully the park staff here in Utah have been in really trying to navigate through what's happening in Washington, D.C. and what's happening locally, and working through a lot of unknowns. So I'm constantly impressed. I have been less impressed with the guidance from Washington. Department of Interior has given very little guidance to help in that reopening, and it's been quite delayed. And so that really leaves the local leaders of the parks to make really difficult decisions and try to walk that line between, the economic impacts and the livelihoods of their neighbors, and making sure everybody's safe in these really rural communities.
Great. Well, with that, we'll wrap this conversation up. This is Cory MacNulty of the National Parks Conservation Association. She helps oversee the Southwest region of the organization. We've been talking about the reopening of our national parks in Utah. We're about, 3 weeks into this experiment, and it will continue through the summer, and we will stay in touch, Cory. Thank you so much.
All right. Nice to talk to you, Brian. Take care.
You bet. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye.